Namaste and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Hindu American Foundation's second annual Advocacy Forum. For those who may not be aware or know much about HAF, HAF was founded in 2003 and has since become the premier advocacy voice for Hindu Americans, working in the areas of public policy, media, education, and so much more. Guided by our motto to promote dignity, mutual respect, and pluralism, our vision is to become a sustained professional voice that would ensure Hindu Americans across the country will be known, heard, and respected for our views. We are grateful to all of those attending this critical event, not only for our organization, but for the entire Hindu American community. At an estimated nearly 3 million strong across the United States, I want to particularly thank those in our delegation who have spent their personal time and resources to join us to ensure their voices are heard here on Capitol Hill. And of course, a big thank you for the civil servants of our government as well as our organizational and interfaith partners for joining us to share their perspectives and also for listening to ours. Our Advocacy Forum will feature discussions about the most timely topics impacting Hindus in the United States and around the world. And while these discussions are not easy to hear or to engage in, it is important nonetheless to be here so that we can bring about change for the betterment of all peoples in the United States. It is at this time I do request that everybody silence their cell phones. That doesn't mean that you don't have to not use them. We actually encourage you to live tweet this event. HAF's handle is @HinduAmerican. We're also streaming this live on Facebook, so you can find the link through our Facebook page. Please note that there are note cards at every seat, so if you want to jot down any questions you may have for our speakers, our volunteers will then collect them and our moderator will direct them to the appropriate panelists. It's now my honor to invite Swaminathan Venkatraman, a member of the National Leadership Council of the Hindu American Foundation, who will start our program today with a traditional invocation. This invocation is for praying for peace in the United States and around the world, and also our prayers are with Steve Scalise, the officers who were injured, as well as staff who were injured in last week's shooting. Swami, as he's more commonly known, is a finance executive based in New York City. He is the lead author of HAF's report on the caste system and LGBT rights in Hinduism, and he is a regular columnist for Swarajya magazine of India, and he's currently focused on developing HAF's chapter in New Jersey. Swami?
Thank you, Jay. Good morning, everybody. There is a class of prayers in Hinduism we call peace mantras, or Shanti mantras. The word Shanti means peace. And they typically tend to be very universal in nature, praying for peace everywhere and in everybody. So what I'm going to do is read a short translation and then chant the prayer itself. May there be peace on earth, in space, and in the heavens. Peace in all horizons and directions, peace in fire, in the air, the sun and the moon, peace in the constellations, in the waters, in the planets, peace in the herbs and the trees, peace towards cattle and all animals, peace towards mankind, peace in the absolute Brahman. May there be peace and only peace, and may that peace be in me, peace alone. Through that peace, may I confirm peace in myself, in all the two-legged and the four-legged animals, and may there be peace in me, peace alone. Om Prativishshantir Antariksha Shantir Dhyau Shantihi Disha Shantir Avantara Disha Shantir Agni Shantihi Vayu Shantir Antariksha Shantir Chandrama Shantihi Nakshatrani Shantir Apashantir Aushadaya Shantihi Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantir Aja Shantihi Ashvashantirpurushashantirbrahmanah shantirev shantihi Shantimastu shantihi Tayaham shantya sarvashantya mahyam dvipade chatushpade cha shantim karomi shantirme astu shantihi Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Good morning. Namaste. Welcome to the Hindu American Foundation Second Annual Advocacy Forum. Today's panel discussion will be about Hindu Americans and civil rights. How can Hindu Americans effectively confront the growing trend of hate-based violence and civil rights violations? I'm pleased today and very proud to introduce four distinguished panelists. And the first is my colleague and fellow co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation, Suhag Shukla. As I mentioned, she is our executive director. She's legal counsel and has been a co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation from 14 years ago. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Religion and a JD from the University of Florida. As legal counsel, Ms. Shukla has helped launch the foundation as a leading voice for religious freedom. She's tasked with many responsibilities, but most relevant to our panel today is cultivating strategic interfaith and intrafaith relationships. She seeks areas of shared interest to advance HAF's objectives in the realms of church-state advocacy and issue-specific dialogue. She has been instrumental in the development of a broad range of educational materials and position papers, is on the editorial team of HAF's groundbreaking human rights report, which will be released this afternoon, and blogs for the Huffington Post. Ms. Shukla is actively involved with Chinmaya Mission, a social, cultural, religious group, and serves on the board of the Bhutanese American Organization of Philadelphia because of her active interest in helping refugees from around the world. Previously, she served on the boards of the Nirvana Center, a Bhutanese Community Resettlement Center, as well as the YWCA of Minneapolis, and was a member of the planning committee of the St. Paul Interfaith Network. Nationally, she serves on religious advisory committees for the Council on Foreign Relations, the Humane Society of the United States, and the Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Shukla will be our moderator. I'm very honored to introduce the Honorable Tom Wheeler. Honorable Tom Wheeler is Acting Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. He has extensive experience in representing schools and other municipal entities throughout the United States in administrative, trial, and appellate matters. He has been chairman and director of National School Boards Association since April 2010, and he has spoken extensively on civil rights issues, addressing national organizations as diverse as the National School Boards Association and the American Civil Liberties Union. And he's also appeared many times at National Public Radio. He speaks to national audiences several times a year on constitutional law and is a prolific author on these topics, as well as a two-time winner of the Indiana State Bar Association's Benjamin Harris Writing Award. He has also won the prestigious Burton Award for Legal Achievement, co-sponsored by the Library of Congress, for his article, Slamming in Cyberspace, the Boundaries of Student First Amendment Rights. The U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division is the institution within our federal government responsible for enforcing federal statutes prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race, sex, disability, religion, and national origin. The division was established in 1957 by Attorney General William Rogers after the Civil Rights Act of 1957 created the Office of Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, who has since headed the division. The head of the Civil Rights Division is an Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights and appointed by the President of the United States. The current acting Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights is Honorable Tom Wheeler. Next, I'd like to introduce Michael Lieberman. He's the Washington Counsel for the Anti-Defamation League and convener of the Hate Crimes Coalition Task Force. He is the 2015 winner of the Attorney General's Award for Meritorious Public Service for Outstanding Contributions to Hate Crimes. The Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, was founded in 1913 to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. And we're all very familiar with the work of the ADL, and H has been a proud partner with them. Now it is the nation's premier civil rights and human rights relations agency. The ADL fights anti-Semitism and all forms of bigotry, defends democratic ideals, and protects civil rights for all. Mr. Lieberman is ADL's point person on federal response to bias-motivated crimes and chairs the broad coalition of groups in Washington promoting improved federal response to hate violence. He has testified on hate crime issues before Congress and before a number of state legislative bodies. He promotes the League's involvement in Washington on a wide variety of domestic policy, equality, criminal justice, and civil rights issues, including religious freedom and the importance of church-state separation. He also directs the ADL Civil Rights Policy Planning Center. It's been an honor for HF to partner again with ADL and a privilege to have him here today. Finally, I'd like to introduce Ron Mori to my right. He's the DC chapter co-president of the Japanese American Citizens League. He's senior advisor in the American Association of Retired Persons Multicultural Leadership Department in Washington, D.C. In 2011, he joined AARP to increase the association's social impact work and membership outreach within the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities for them. In 2015, he was asked to lead their national strategy with American Indian and Alaska Native communities. He's also co-president of the Japanese American Citizens League, DC chapter, and a member of AARP's Asian Strategic Engagement Employee Research. He's a regular contributing columnist in the Pacific Citizen newspaper. He's a returning OCA Business Advisory Council member and a former board member of the Donors Forum of Chicago, Neighborhood Housing Services of Chicago, and the Chicago Fire Department Survive Alive House Foundation. In addition, he was a volunteer crew captain supporting multiple fire departments in suburban Chicago. He is a former chair of the Asian Americans / Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy, Chicago chapter. In 2003, he was a founding member of Chicago's first Asian Giving Circle in partnership with the Chicago Community Trust. He received a Bachelor of Science degree in Consumer Affairs from Purdue University in Indiana. He'll also be giving us some pointed memories about what occurred in this country 60, 70 years back with the Japanese internment. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Suhag, who will be moderating this panel today. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Hera, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us this morning, and as well as our participants today. We have, I think, what will be an engaging conversation on Hindu Americans and civil rights. So 2017 has been a tumultuous year for ethnic and religious minorities. It's been marked with increases in hate crimes, harassment, discrimination, and anti-minority and anti-immigrant sentiment. In February, the Hindu American community was rocked by the horrific hate crime shooting and murder of Srinivas Kuchibutla, as well as the shooting of Alok Madasani, Indian Hindu immigrants in Olathe, Kansas. Hindu American Foundation has been working with the community there, with other organizations, and as well with Department of Justice. And so I think what has happened is it's brought about an awareness in our community. There's been a number of incidents following Olathe. I believe that as a result of the coverage of these stories, I think our community in particular has become more aware, and therefore we might see an increase in reporting of these types of things. And so that might be, in some sense, a silver lining, that with awareness comes maybe lessening of apathy, so that we can better protect our communities. To discuss these issues further, we have an esteemed panel here. who are really on the front lines of preventing as well as responding to incidents of hate as well as violations of civil rights. And we'll hear about major trends in hate-based violence and harassment, in discrimination that's targeting ethnic and religious minorities in our country, as well as how government and law enforcement at all levels, from local up to federal, can effectively address these trends and better protect vulnerable communities. We'll also talk about the role of media and the public education system and how stereotypes might perpetuate these types of incidents, as well as what steps the Hindu American community can take in proactively combating biased motivated violence, hate speech, and bullying and harassment, especially in K through 12 schools, as well as the role of the federal government in preventing and responding to such incidents. So the way that our panel will work today is each of our esteemed panelists will give opening remarks for about 10 minutes each. And then we have note cards and pens at your seats. If you don't have note cards, borrow one from your neighbor if they're not using all of theirs. And please, as you're hearing each one of them offer their remarks, jot down any questions. We have volunteers. Can our volunteers just stand real quick? There we go. Those are our summer interns. They will pick up the cards, and we'll try to do our best to get through all of them. At the end, we'll have just a few minutes for closing remarks. So with that, I hand off to you.
Thank you. Again, as was mentioned, my name is Tom Wheeler. I'm the Acting Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. Civil Rights Division broadly enforces all of our nation's anti-discrimination statutes. That's a broad gamut. Let me give you an idea. We have 11 components. We have the criminal section. So the criminal section enforces the criminal civil rights statutes, and I'll talk that in a little bit more detail with respect to the Kansas shooting. And they also enforce our hate crime statutes broadly, not just against persons, but also against property. I have a disability rights section, which enforces all the nation's disability rights, Section 504 of the ADA. I have an education section, which enforces all the education statutes. We do that, and I know we'll probably talk about classroom bullying K-12. We do that in conjunction with the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. We have a very close working relationship with them, so we enforce both Title VI and Title IX and have a series of MOUs. They really investigate, and then their only remedy really is to take away federal funds. We can actually litigate against entities that are tolerating that kind of bias, and that's a subject near and dear to my heart. I think it was mentioned briefly. I've spent kind of my professional career in education, in a lot of education law, and one of my areas of work is in bullying, cyberbullying, harassment. And so I've done a lot of work on that, and it's this struggle with, I get the First Amendment protections, but like the Library of Congress article talked about, there's a limit, okay? And we've got to figure out, in schools in particular, how to work within the confines of the First Amendment to deal with this kind of speech, because it's just extraordinarily damaging, particularly at the K-12 level, because the stigmatization that goes on. I have an employment law section which enforces Title VII, typically in the state employment, the government employment context. I have a housing section which enforces housing discrimination. I have an immigration section, which was kind of a surprise to me actually, but we have an immigration employment rights section. We also have a policy strategy section. We have a voting section which enforces all the federal voting laws. And then we have a special litigation section which does police consent decrees, large pattern and practice cases, litigation against states for discrimination. The key part, my criminal section, which prosecutes the hate crimes. Many of these are pretty high profile stuff. Obviously the Kansas shooting. We work very closely with Michael and Jonathan at the ADL on the Jewish Community Center threats case, which was just devastating on that community, I know, and it was a difficult investigation, but we, working with the FBI, did the investigation, and we're doing the prosecution of Michael Kadar if at some point he makes his way back to the United States from Israel. But we also prosecute all sorts of hate crimes. We prosecute Robert Doggart. He's a gentleman who recently solicited a man to help him attack a mosque in Islamburg, New York. We've got, as I mentioned, JCC threats case, Bakersfield case, guy got 15 years in prison for shooting a shotgun towards a Latino family in their front yard, yelling to get them out of town. Those are the kind of, we have the broad breadth of cases. Most recently, as you mentioned, on June 9th, we announced the indictment of Adam Puritan for the shootings in Olathe, Kansas. Key to that, in mind, is we had a lot of options in terms of charging the various crimes he had. Had a gamut of potential sentences. That was the other new thing for me coming out of the civil context. We chose to seek the death penalty in that case, so it's a death eligible crime. The Attorney General actually has to certify all death penalty cases, so they go up. The Attorney General reviews that and makes the final call, but we've recommended, my section, I've recommended the death penalty in that case, and I asked for it as part of our initial indictment. We do that kind of for two reasons. One, the nature of the crime, and two, I think we need to send a very strong message that that kind of behavior will be tolerated, particularly, I won't go into the facts of the case, but his prior incidents, what he did directly that night when not only did he shoot the first victim, but the second victim was crawling out of the bar and he went out after him to kill him. The determination that he was doing, I think, personally, I think deserves a death penalty. So that's why we chose to go that direction. We're going to talk. I'm going to probably let Michael talk about stats because ADL likes to talk about stats. One of the things you'll learn in this.
Is that another way of saying that I'm kind of geeky?
One of the things you'll find, and I think we all agree, and this will come out in a minute, but the data is not particularly good in this area in terms of hate crimes, and it's for a couple of different reasons that I think we can get into more detail in a minute. But one, it's a grossly underreported situation. Number two, the definition of what a hate crime is, and three, the method by which we collect data. If we look at, in our case, and I'll talk a little bit about VJS statistics, we have a report that's going to come out, coincidentally enough, on June 29th. But I've got a pre-read and I've got a little bit of information that I can share out of that. But the problem is the FBI statistics, they rely on police report, incidents reported to the police. We know that a vast majority of incidents aren't reported to the police for a variety of different reasons. The most recent surveys actually tell us, and that's a pre-read on this, is we're getting some real good data on why people aren't reporting, and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But we've got to figure out a way to increase reporting because the other thing we rely on is the NVRS. It's basically a telephone survey going out every month. It basically says, have you been a victim of a hate crime? That's good and bad. It gives us some broad numbers, but it doesn't really define what I might think of as a hate crime, Michael might not think is a hate crime. If somebody says something at school, if they link it to some racial comment, when do we cross the threshold? The criminal stuff, the prosecutor stuff, they've got a very specific definition of a hate crime. So we've got to figure that out. That was the segue to the fact that in this department, I will tell you, this particular Attorney General takes this issue very, very seriously. He's been very, very aggressive on hate crimes across the board. He actually, we created a transgender task force to view. There's a whole series of transgender murders. I don't think they're linked in any way, but there's a couple of organizations that track that. They may have been prostitutes. They're kind of the lost people that they just get lost, okay, and nobody's really out around. And so we've opened a task force and we've reinvestigated that. And that was the Attorney General. I was in the meeting with him and he said, we need to do this. We need to look at this. And actually we're reopening a couple of them right now that have been closed by local authorities and indeed an FBI. We went back and said, relook at it, pull this stuff and find out what's going on. And there are a variety of these. So as part of that commitment, we have a violent crimes task force. There's a huge summit this week, Tuesday and Wednesday, on dealing with violent crime. Originally, and we created 4 committees, and there's a subcommittee on hate crimes. How do we deal with hate crimes? It was originally part of the violent crimes task force, but it became big enough, we pulled it out, and we have a separate hate crime summit on June 29th. We've invited, you guys are invited to attend, I think at least, I don't know if you're coming or is Jay coming? Okay. But the point of that is to have a conversation about the same thing that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about reporting. we're going to talk about prosecuting, we're going to talk about investigating hate crimes, and trying to figure out how to do a better job, but bringing in people from all of the communities. You guys are coming, I assume. I saw you on the invite list at least. But all the communities to come in and have that conversation. The AG will kick it off, and we'll sit down, and it isn't a talking head summit, okay? We're not sitting up here talking. It's around the table, sit down and figure out what's going on summit. And so that's why we kind of had to limit membership, because we wanted participation. So as you talk to people in here, give them, if it's Jay or whoever comes, give them your ideas. We'll take these ideas back, whatever you discuss. But that's really our thing, because that's going to come up with legislative changes. There's some changes that need to be made in statutes. I think I've seen some stuff from you guys, but there's some, I think we need to, last thing, I'm running a little bit long. The problem with the hate crime statutes is they're patchwork. They kind of put here and put here and put over here. They don't fit together, they don't interlock, so there's gaps in those statutes. So we're going to try to fill those gaps with our legislative package, because I think we need to do that to make sure there's just not, you can do this, but you can't do that. You know, we have this interstate commerce link in certain areas, so we can't prosecute somebody unless we can change interstate commerce. So we're going to do all that as part of the Hate Crime Summit. You're going to see a real focus on hate crimes legislatively. The other thing that will happen, and it's actually already happened, is we're moving substantial additional resources into my hate crimes unit in the area. I'm not supposed to use numbers, but preliminarily 25 to 30 attorneys solely dedicated to prosecuting those cases. So we're taking it seriously, and we're getting on it, and I appreciate the time to talk with you guys, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for that. I'll now ask Michael to share some thoughts.
Suhag, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. So I know this is the second annual policy conference. I've participated in 100% of the policy conferences so far. So I really hope that this will continue to be a trend, that you will do these policy conferences. Jay, I know it's a lot of work, but it's really, really important when you all show up for these policy conferences to talk to important policymakers, coalition allies. It totally makes a difference. Every year, all year long, Jay is at meetings talking about how he represents the Hindu America Foundation, and it's powerful and cares about things and likes to be involved in things. And then when you show up, it totally matters. So thank you for being here, and thank you for the work that you're going to do. I hope you're familiar with the work of the Anti-Defamation League. As mentioned, about a 100-year-old organization founded by the Jewish community in 1913. But we soon realized that the security of the Jewish community was totally tied up in the security of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American males and other religious minorities, and everyone's religious freedom and democratic ideals are connected to one another. So we are stopping the defamation of the Jewish people, that's part of our mission, and securing justice and fair treatment for all. And we don't really see those as competing parts of the mission, but very much complementary. And to do that, we have taken hate crime very seriously. In 1979, we started collecting incidents of anti-Semitism against the Jewish community. It's the audit of anti-Semitic incidents. We've been doing it every year since 1979. It's not scientific. It's done by the ADL regional offices around the country, but it gives us a baseline. Data drives policy. I might say that again when I talk about your 2016 HAF bullying prevention survey that you did. And how important that document was for going forward. Data drives policy. 3 years after the audit, we wrote a model hate crime statute. And now either that statute or a permutation of it is law in 45 states and the District of Columbia. Only Indiana, hello Purdue colleagues, Indiana, Wyoming, Arkansas, South Carolina, and Georgia are the only states in America that have a hate crime law. We think every state should have a hate crime law. We think they should cover all categories. Very, very important to do that. ADL I really would rather be an expert, Suhag and colleagues, on anything other than hate crime. When I first worked for a member of Congress, he was a member of Congress from Kansas, and I became the resident expert on grain elevator bankruptcies. Maybe that would have been a different career path, but for better or worse, that's what I've been doing for the Anti-Defamation League, working on hate crime issues since I started working for the ADL in 1982, my third job out of law school. It's much better, I will tell you. There's a few secrets. I don't know who's tweeting this. This is one of the secrets. Don't tweet this. It's much, much better to prevent hate crimes than to prosecute them. You have somebody who obviously is demonstrating that the Justice Department is totally open for business. The case in Kansas, I don't know how familiar you are with how frequently the Justice Department is involved in hate crimes. It's not that frequent. The Matthew Shepard Act passed in 2009. I think there's 40 cases under the Matthew Shepard Act since then, approximately that number, and this was really fast. Usually they wait for and appropriately so. There were 6,000 hate crimes reported by the FBI in 2015, the most recent data, and 40 since 2009 that the Justice Department has done under the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. They also do cross-burning cases. There's arson cases, other federal criminal civil rights statutes, but the Matthew Shepard Act, just 40 cases. And this was incredibly fast, and I think it demonstrated, number one, a tremendous commitment that the Justice Department has on this, and also the power of the community to say, this totally matters to us. And if they're not going to be able to do it effectively in Kansas, I'm sure that Kansas officials wanted to do the best, but I don't know the background, and the acting assistant attorney general for civil rights will probably not tell us in open forum the background, but I'm sure there was some kind of a collaborative discussion that went on, who is best to prosecute this case, and the decision was made to do it at the Justice Department, and then no waiting, just really doing it in a very fast way, which is extremely satisfactory. So Tom Wheeler mentioned data, so if I'm forced, I'll give you a little data. There are 87 cities in America, over 100,000 in population, that either affirmatively told the FBI that they had 0 hate crimes in 2015, or they did not report at all. And I'm talking about big cities like Honolulu, did not report at all. Miami, a city of 500,000, they have not reported data to the FBI since 2004. Maybe you've been to Miami, perfectly lovely place, and you're from Miami. You'll have to take my word for it. It's a really lovely place. It's pretty demographically, diverse. You think there haven't been any hate crimes in Miami since 2004? No. Some years they affirmatively report 0, some years they don't report at all. That is a problem. And it should be a problem also for law enforcement. One of the things that I very much hope will come up in the violent crime task force meetings that are happening later this week is it's good for law enforcement to know the magnitude of the community disorders and tensions in a community. If you're flying blind in Miami and you don't know, we're really picking on Miami. There are 87 cities that we could pick on. But if you're flying blind and you don't know the magnitude of the threat of the community disorders, then you are not effectively deterring crime, allocating your resources effectively. So that is something that we think law enforcement should care about, but the group should care about it. If you're gay in Miami, you think you would, and you're not out to your family, or you're a new immigrant, or Uncle Juan is an undocumented individual, he lives with you, you're citizens, but you don't want to, you're worried about your undocumented relative, why would you come forward in a city that has a track record of not reporting to the FBI? You want to have the transparency. You want to have a mission statement on the website for a police department. You want to have a way to report to the police department. You want to be open for business in a way that makes people want to be able to report. One of the questions that Suhag asked me to address is how can the Hindu community do better on protecting itself? With 700 temples across the country, unfortunately, there have been instances where religious institutions have been attacked. There's also federal criminal statutes and federal civil statutes that protect the rights of religious institutions, but you as activists and advocates in the Hindu American community. The first time you should meet the police chief in your town is not after your temple has been vandalized. You hope it doesn't happen at all, but you should establish those relationships ahead of time, have those types of relationships. This year was the first year ever that the FBI collected anti-Hindu hate crimes, and the reason they did it is because of your advocacy and the advocacy of the coalition that worked on behalf of it. Jay was at the table, Suhag was at the table, and it totally matters. Data drives policy. So 5 anti-Hindu hate crimes in 2015 is definitely not the accurate number, but every year the data will get better. 257 anti-Muslim hate crimes, over 600 anti-Jewish hate crimes. Anti-Jewish hate crimes have always been 50 to 80% of the anti-religious hate crimes. In 2015, the number of anti-religious hate crimes was the largest percentage of hate crimes in the 25-year history of the Hate Crime Statistics Act signed into law by George Bush I in 1990. That is a very disturbing statistic. Do you think there's a connection between the climate, the discussion around the election, the divisiveness, the polarization that we lament, all of us, and people's willingness to take out violence on others? I think the answer is yes. And finally, I want to talk about bullying, because this too is the way to prevent hate crime. Your report in 2016 is incredibly important and incredibly disturbing that 1/3 of all the Hindu students that you surveyed said that they had been the victim of bullying. That is unacceptable. Bullying is not a rite of passage. I hope we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about this in the back and forth, but we have ways and ideas, and I'm going to give you an assignment right now. Only 45 states in the District of Columbia have hate crime laws, but every state has an anti-bullying law. And you should know what your bullying law does in your state. And you should know if your school district is implementing the bullying law. And you should know if your school, where your children go, or your grandchildren, or your nieces or nephews, or your sister's nieces and nephews, where those people go, are they implementing the bullying law? It can make a difference. The bullying law doesn't say no bullying. That would be ridiculous. What it says is you must have a policy on bullying. Notice requirements, discipline requirements, accountability requirements. We help to write those laws too. They're incredibly important. I hope we can talk more about it in the question and answer time.
Thank you, Michael. If I can add some extra credit to your homework. Oftentimes in our community we think, well, it was just a minor transgression. It's not worth reporting. But oftentimes that's the only way that law enforcement might be able to detect a trend. And unfortunately, violence started somewhere that may have seemed very minor. So, in addition to knowing the laws, there's also, I think, it's incumbent upon us to report things, even if they seem small, because it does assist law enforcement. With that, we'll ask Ron to talk about the media and public education and how stereotypes might impact what we're talking about
Great,
today.
thank you. An honor to be here this morning. A couple of things that kind of stood out and struck me right away is that I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal story and then talk about media and education, which is very important. 2017 marks the 75th anniversary of Executive Order 9066. The Executive Order 9066 was signed by FDR, and that impacted approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry. 70% were US citizens, but the government at that time made language a little softer and said they were non-aliens. So it was a way to say instead of citizens, it was non-aliens. And I'll come back to that point. And then 30% were immigrants that at that time, because of the laws in the United States, they could not become naturalized citizens. So a lot of things have changed for the better during that time. Both of my parents were 14 at that time, and they were impacted by that Executive Order 9066. So they were old enough to certainly remember the impact in their lives and what happened with their parents or my grandparents, who I actually, when I was growing up in the Chicago area, and that's the reason why I have a Chicago experience, being of Japanese American ancestry and not a West Coast experience like my parents and the majority of my cousins who have a West Coast experience. But we'll talk a little bit about that. So if you can imagine, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941 on December 7th, approximately 2 months later, because of the war and the hysteria, especially on the West Coast, this impacted, like I said, 120,000 Japanese Americans or Japanese people with ancestry on the West Coast to then be relocated to 10 official, they call them relocation centers. So again, soft language by the government, but to 10 official centers that were in remote places across the United States. In the case of my mother, she was in Poston, Arizona. My father in a community called Aurora, Arkansas, of all places. Prior to that time, they had approximately less than about 2 weeks to sell their businesses and to then be really forced and moved to assembly centers, in the case of my father's family, to the Santa Anita racetrack where they were put in horse stalls, and then eventually moved by train to Arkansas. In my mother's case, they were farmers in the Huntington Beach area. They were relocated to Poston, Arizona. The actual camps themselves had barbed wire guard towers with armed guards that were pointing guns in the camps. During this period of time, as I said, my mother and father, they were not married at the time, they didn't know each other, but they were both 14. So they certainly remember how their lives were disrupted. They later in life kind of talked about the impact that it had to their parents, which they were both, well, my father's side, they had fruit stands, and my mother's side, they were farmers in the area. But basically, they were starting from scratch after 4 years in these internment camps. We call them in the Japanese American community American concentration camps. And the reason why we say that is because, again, there were armed guards, there was barbed wire, they were not free to leave. And I mention that because when we talk about what dialogue is taking place right now, especially with a lot of the executive orders or just dialogue about hate crimes, especially in my case, when you look at me, I am Sansei, so that's third generation Japanese American. My parents would have been Nisei, or second generation. That will never change in terms of the appearance. But it's an American story that going through high school, I really didn't read a lot about the American concentration camps. There maybe was a sentence or two that I can remember my sophomore year in high school that I started to dig deeper because I wanted to know more. So I started talking to my parents. It wasn't something that my parents talked about at all until I started asking about that. My mother's still living. She's about, she's 90, she's going to be 90. And so she talks a little bit about the fact that, and this was later in life, how it impacted her personally. I had an uncle that to the day he passed away refused to stand in any line for a restaurant. And we found out later that Uncle Shig, his whole point was, I stood in so many lines for 4 years in Arkansas that I'm not going to stand in any more lines. So it was always a constant rush to another restaurant wherever we were because we had to find someplace that that didn't have any lines. But at any rate, it was one of those quirky things. But on the side of what the impact has been for the Japanese American community, I should mention that the Japanese American Citizens League, JACL, was established in 1929, so well before World War II. It is the oldest and largest Asian American Pacific Islander civil rights organization in the country. We work across coalitions, especially as it relates to hate crimes, bigotry, We are there. We are in over 100 different chapters that we call across the United States. So we would love to keep those dialogues open. There's definitely a lot of work that's been done, and I do highlight this. The Smithsonian American History Museum, if you haven't been there recently, they opened up an exhibit on February 19th, which is called Our Day of Remembrance. And the Day of Remembrance is the day that the Executive Order 9066 was signed, so 75 years ago. This exhibit, called Japanese Americans Righting a Wrong, it's during the Japanese American experience during World War II and after, is an exhibit that is going to be up through February 19th of 2018. And this exhibit talks about what happened during that time period in American history, and also how it relates to today's environment. And when you look back, and it's been documented, as to what happened in American history, there were a couple key pieces that were there. There was prejudice, certainly, for the Japanese American citizens as well as immigrants. They stood out. They definitely were of Asian American descent. Prejudice was one thing. You also had the hysteria of war. You could make comparison today about the terrorism. And then you had a lack of really political leadership and representation from the community. So when we're here together and we're talking about, that's important. When you have exhibits like the American History Museum having this exhibit on what happened 75 years ago, that's important. They actually have the document, the Executive Order 9066, on loan from the National Archives in that exhibit. Comcast, I have to call out Comcast, because during the month of May, for AAPI History Month, they actually had interviews or various segments from the Asian American Pacific Islander community where they highlighted different communities. And we had a chance to actually talk about the exhibit, but also the Japanese American experience through the lens of the camps and what we've learned. So that was important. On the media side as well, there's been a lot of controversy in terms of what they're calling Asian roles that are being whitewashed. There's groups that are coming together to talk about that. There's been a lot of, which you didn't have years ago, the social media that's exploding, and a lot of criticism when that does happen. So you're seeing a lot of voices that have not been represented before coming together to be a bigger voice, which is very important. So I'll kind of end with that on that note.
Thank you so much. If you have questions, there's note cards, so please write them, and the volunteers, you can just raise your hand with your cards. And while our volunteers are picking up questions, are you at liberty to share some of those numbers, or?
Well, one of the striking numbers that the question is why don't, and they started surveying this in 2011 and 2015, is why people don't report hate crimes. So 54% of hate crime victimizations weren't reported to police. So the question is why? I mean, why do you think they don't? All right, I'll throw them out.
I'm sure where there's something.
Well, that's a fair statement. The actual 40% of them weren't reported because they were handled another way. All right. I think a good chunk of these are probably school related, because the two reasons, the two that were specifically cited were when they said it was handled another way. It was either to report to an apartment manager, so there's something going on with that, or to a school official. So the 20% they didn't report because they said they weren't important enough. Okay, that's what the victims reported. 5.1% police could not do anything. 17.5% police would not help. We didn't really drill down as to where that was. And then 17% is just an amalgam of others. So I think that was kind of striking to me, is that when we got more than half of the hate crimes not being reported, they're not there. One of the things that I've heard, and sorry, I'm going to promote you. Michael will probably talk about is this idea of kind of an isolated group not reporting. You mentioned undocumented individuals, people like that being prevented from reporting. The other thing, and you know, I've got 3 kids that are just out of high school. I mean, there are times when your kids go, don't tell anybody, you know, don't tell anybody. And that's what we've got to figure out, is this worry that whether it's a school or an employer or anybody else, this concern for retaliation, this concern that someone will do something because of that. That's where we've really got to come together, and that's part of our conversation for next week, and looking at that.
Okay. I don't know who I'm going to give this question to. And Samir, I think you know this is your handwriting. So with hate crimes, with categorizing incidents based on motivation, oftentimes, at least for our community, there's so much overlap between religious identity and ethnic identity, mistaken identity. How is that perhaps complicating statistics gathering? And I don't
Yeah,
know,
well,
Michael,
that's,
you might have something to add to that.
I'll pass the mic on just 1 second. I know we identified him as a data key. With respect to, well, the Kansas case, okay? I mean, that was obviously a case of mistaken identity. I mean, it was a hate crime, but he thought he was shooting Muslims. That's what he said. It turned out, so he didn't target them because they were Indian or Hindu. He targeted them because he thought they were Muslim. So that skews it. But I'll throw to Michael because he's got a whole chart in front of him he's ready to go with.
I do have a whole chart in front of me. You can have this chart in front of you too. It's at the ADL website, adl.org, and there's a lot, so many more charts than you probably want. But this chart is one that breaks down the data. That's where I got the 5. Do you think there were 5 anti-Hindu hate crimes in America in 2015? I think not. But I think it's part of it is like a willingness to report, and I think part of this is don't know that the police will do anything about it, it's too small, I don't, shah is what they say in the Jewish community, like let's not make a big deal about it, we need to just paint over the anti-Hindu slogans on the side of our temple, let's not make a big deal about it in our community. That is the wrong approach. If you do not take these crimes seriously, then law enforcement will not take them seriously. And we have I think, learn as communities and unfortunately as victims and targets that this is something that's very, very important. Hate crime laws are colorblind. If you're attacked because you're a white male, that obviously would be a hate crime too. That's and the FBI keeps track of that data too. I guess the thing that I would say in response to this is it's also a matter of trusting in the police. So it's one thing like the statistics that Tom Wheeler is talking about are survey data. You don't know how many crimes occurred in Tulsa or Kansas City or Cincinnati or Boca from the BJS National Crime Victimization Survey. So it's kind of useful to give you some broad overviews, but we think the FBI data is so much more important because it's actual crimes. You actually know how many were committed in Cincinnati, how many were committed in Tulsa. And if Tulsa says 0, then you have to go to them and say, really, 0? There's a measure of accountability that we see in that too. But this is the one point I want to make. You must report that you are the victims of hate crime. We need to do a better job on that. Jay was part of a team, Suhag was part of it too, that created the best hate crime training manual on the planet. And you can find it. It's the FBI's hate crime training manual. And I think it's weird for a civil rights attorney to come before HAF and say the best hate crime training manual in the planet is the FBI hate crime training manual. But the reason it's the best is because we wrote it. We wrote it, Jay wrote it, the National Center for Transgender Equality wrote it, the Human Rights Campaign wrote it, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Association of University Women. Who knows what a gender non-conforming hate crime is? The transgender community knows what a gender non-conforming hate crime is. The HRC knows what a gender, and so we had the kind of relationship and partnership with the FBI that we wrote the scenarios. We wrote the definitions. There is some really ugly anti-Hindu language in this report. If you are one of those people who does not want to see anti-Hindu language, then do not download this document. But we insisted, Suhag insisted, that we put in bad language about Hindus and about Muslims and about Jews and about gays, because that's what happens in a hate crime. And we wanted law enforcement to be able to know what a anti-Hindu hate crime looks like. And unfortunately, it's frequently accompanied by really nasty slurs. And I think this is the only government document that includes slurs. And it's because the groups insisted on it. And we wanted you to be empowered to report. We wanted the Justice Department to be able to be empowered to collect. We wanted the police departments to be able to identify it.
So let me actually ask both of you, Michael and Ron, in terms of, there's all these tools or I guess an infrastructure that's set up in order to protect our communities. But oftentimes we do have that apathy, or sometimes there's a knowledge gap. This resource has been there for years. I don't know how many actual citizens know that it's there. What can we learn from the experience of the Jewish American community and the Japanese American community in terms of reducing that knowledge gap and addressing apathy?
Well, for sure, just open dialogue like we're having right now. I could tell you horror stories of myself personally growing up, and every December 7th was not a fun day for me at school, especially as I got started getting to high school. And a lot of that came actually from teachers that were good intention of just joking, but it was very hurtful. And as a high school student, when you try to respond with logic to say, I am of Japanese ancestry, however, guess what? I had two uncles that fought in the 442nd for the US Army, and you're trying to reason with then the teacher, it just kind of is like, well, what is he talking about and what is that about, right? So December 7th, for a lot of Japanese Americans that were during that time period going to school was not fun. The dialogue that we have working across different coalition members certainly is so important. I can remember Vincent Chin, right, from it's 25 years, I believe, right now, is the unfortunate situation. Vincent Chin, Chinese American, Detroit, was going out for his bachelor party, and unfortunately he was murdered because he was mistaken for being a Japanese auto worker. And that was during a time in the economy when Japanese auto manufacturing was perceived to be taking away jobs. Sad situation within the community, but it also brought the community together in terms of addressing a tragic situation like that. The statistics and sharing of that data, even though we all agree that probably they're underrepresented, but this dialogue and Michael going out and talking about it, the JACL, the OCA, all of us going out and talking about that to make sure we're meeting with elected officials and talking about the issues at hand, very important.
Yeah, I guess I would just want to add something to what Ron is saying that has to do with prevention. And there too, I think we're talking about bullying and about stopping activities from escalating in communities. Making sure that these incidents are taken seriously, making sure that we are doing whatever we can to prevent them. And if I may, Suhag, I'd also like to just kind of segue into religious freedom. The United States is unlike any other country on earth. This concept that we have in the First Amendment. I think that from the Jewish community perspective, the reason why the Jewish community in America is secure and prosperous, I think the reason why the Hindu American community has the opportunity to be secure and prosperous is the First Amendment and this concept of a separation between church and state, and that religion cannot be established by the United States government, that no government can establish a religion, and I think that that is part of it as well. The idea that we have the right to practice our religion and that nobody's religion should be imposed upon us. Some of the briefs that HAF have signed with the ADL are exactly on that point. I'm sure reasonable people in the room will disagree on same-sex marriage, the efficacy of it, the biblical aspects of it, the traditional aspects of it, but the idea that someone should be able to discriminate against someone else on the basis of who they love is something that the United States Supreme Court has said is unconstitutional. And that concept of religious discrimination and not letting religious freedom be used as a sword to thwart someone else's religious liberty is an incredibly important concept that prevents violence, that prevents community disorders. And we need to be able to honor and respect everyone's religious freedom without trying to suggest that one religious perspective is better or should be able to triumph or dictate as your employer over the religious practices of the employees. And I think that, too, sets a frame for America to be able to make it a safe and hospitable place for religious minorities like Hindus in America. 2.5 million, is that the number that people say? That's small in 330 million. You know, the vast majority of people in the United States are Christians, but it's not a Christian country, and it shouldn't be seen as a place where Christian views must dominate and all the other views must be subservient.
So let me just jump on real quick. I want to focus on education, because from the Civil Rights Division, we're really prosecutors, but the one place we are focused on education is educating law enforcement. And law enforcement to report these crimes, to solicit these crimes. In some ways, the hate crimes are somewhat easy because generally they'll tell you why they did it. Mr. Puritan was very, very clear why he did it, had made threats, yelled them, left the bar, came back. He was very clear. So in those cases, it's pretty easy to do it. But with respect to other, where we don't have a murders, the one aspect we can look at hate crimes, murders are pretty easy because they always get reported. We don't have this reporting problem. And so we can really track hate crimes through murders in terms of just a total. We kind of know all the murders that are hate crimes because one, they usually tell you they did it, and two, there's a body, so we can prosecute those. We've got a good picture of those. But from an education standpoint, beyond those easy ones, we've got to train police officers and law enforcement agencies to ask why, okay? Not just you got beat up, but why did you get beaten up? Because that's a flaw in our process. That's the education that we need to do. But I think schools, everybody else needs to do the same thing. All right, you did this, but why did you do it? We've got to look behind it. And that's the education process that guys like Michael can do. We can work jointly with school board associations, but outreach, it's education, I think, is the most important method of combating this stuff, whether it's us doing it with the police or you doing it with the constituent groups.
I'm going to have like a little set of questions that are, I'm trying to weave them together and I can't, so I'm just going to ask them in random order. We talked about some of the issues in reporting and data collection being confusion over, not confusion, well, yes, confusion as well as inconsistency and gaps in hate crime legislation. What would the ideal hate crime statute look like? Where are the major gaps?
And I'll let Michael talk to it. I don't want to trigger too much because I'm not allowed to talk about our legislative package. We've sort of already developed it. But there are significant gaps. What would be nice to see is a unified statute, where we're not picking and choosing. But it depends on whether Congress is passing it through their Commerce Clause, which is interstate commerce. I'll give you an example. Here's an easy gap. If somebody goes up and in a case I had at Cincinnati, they defaced the mosque, okay? But that particular statute involving that particular crime, I have to show an interstate commerce link. So I mean, it gets ridiculous. We're down there trying to figure out whether the marker he used to deface the mosque was made overseas. All right, we've got those gaps because it was passed under the Commerce Clause. It's that sort of thing that creates difficulty. The Shepard Berg one was passed under the Commerce Clause. So when there's an assault, I have one. There's a case in Virginia. It was an attack on a man who was self-declared gay because he was gay, and it was in an Amazon facility. That's got to be as interstate commerce as you get. Yet, we're fighting a motion to dismiss on that case because they're arguing it's not interstate commerce. All right, that's an issue because of this patchwork session. So we're gonna try to fill those gaps. That'll come out. That's part of our legislative package coming out, and that's probably as far as I can go on my legislative package.
No, go for it.
Because it's no. Next week.
That would be great.
I don't want to tell you it's all been decided before you talk. But those we've made preliminary recommendations to fill a lot of those gaps.
Look, I think that however good this legislative proposal is going to be, and we'll try to make it as good as it can be too. It's not going to be the be-all, end-all. There's only a certain number of federal law enforcement officials, FBI. I really hope you will bulk up the Civil Rights Division hate crime unit. That'll be great. But still, there's going to be 18,000 law enforcement agencies around the country, and they're going to have first-line authority. 6,000 hate crimes were committed in 2015. 40 Matthew Shepard cases since 2009. There's no way the federal government can do everything. We don't want them to do everything. We want the cops in Cincinnati and Tulsa and Boca to be able to know what to do, to be able to have that frontline responsibility. We want the feds to do exactly what they have been able to do, which is be the backstop authority when state and locals either can't or won't. Mississippi affirmatively reported 0 hate crimes in 2015. I don't know. I think that's probably wrong. And so the question is, does federal government be able to back up what's happening in Mississippi? That would be really important. But the state and locals are going to be the most important. There are efforts that have been made in California. Raise your hands if you're from any of these states. California, Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Virginia. So in all of those places, complementing what the Justice Department is doing, the attorneys general in those places have set up a hotline, a state hotline. We don't want a national hotline because we're worried about how that would be implemented. But I think someone in the attorney general's office in Virginia will know what the Virginia hate crime law is, will know what the victim services are in Virginia, will be able to effectively respond to that. We've promoted those types of responses to hate violence post-election, from the election campaign. A number of these were set up. That's really important work. That too is something that if you don't live in a state like that, that's a conversation to have with your attorney general. That is a state and local complement to what the Justice Department is trying to do.
So this is maybe a little bit more philosophical or a question of principle. And I know that this is something that I personally faced in our own temple, where after the incident in Kansas, there was real fear in the community. And we're easily identifiable. We might have the dot, we might be wearing our Indian clothing, our skin color is different. So there were conversations that were going on in the community in terms of, avoid wearing Indian clothing outside, avoid having the dot, avoid public displays of your religion. And then there's this tension of mainstreaming. What do we tell communities out there that are really fearful, and it's very outwardly apparent that they belong to a minority religion or a minority community?
I'll make a cliched statement. I'll throw it around. The cliched statement is that's precisely what they're trying to do. You make yourself a victim by buying into that. That's the point of doing a hate crime. I mean, the Justice Department's been prosecuting these going back before the Civil Rights Division was created. Why does somebody burn a cross in somebody's yard? That's what they want to do. They want you to hide. They want you to go away. And I understand the reaction, and that's why we moved. I thank Michael for the kind words. We understand that. That's why we moved so quickly on it. And that's why we sought the death penalty. We want to make it very, very clear that that's going to be handled. It's not going to be tolerated, and we're going to use whatever resources we have to do so that does not happen, because that's just creating victims of everyone.
Not rehearsed, but I was just going to say I have to compliment you on, I call it a voice book, but it's not. It's the real questions about Hinduism. And the more you could do to educate non-Hindus about some of the questions and why there's a dress and why you get, why there is the red dot, that is going to certainly broaden and help on that. Very similar to I call a Power of Words handbook from the Japanese American Citizens League. You're right, we're never going to change our external appearance, right? And so the more openness we could have, this particular voice book from the Japanese American Citizens League has been integrated into school systems in California and in Portland, where we have, and in other communities where there are strong chapters. So again, open, I can remember growing up in the Chicagoland area where we would open up our temple to the community. Probably has been done before, but it was just that opening up and then having the fact that we're a Boy Scout troop. Yes, we had judo, we had kendo, we had softball leagues and basketball leagues. We had a summer bazaar, and that was a very open kind of barbecue and things like that. All were invited, but very impressed with the real questions about Hinduism, peace, and the more that you could do to educate and outreach, very important.
Michael, maybe you can tell us a little bit. I'm going to swag into schools. Like I said, these are patchwork questions. And talk a little bit about the No Place for Hate and some of the programs in which we have a lot of community leaders here and how we can get involved at the grassroots level.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mentioned that ADL does anti-bias work. These are my two summer people, Sally and Matt, on the side, and they have learned that the plurality of the ADL's budget goes into anti-bias work, anti-bullying work, don't hate your neighbor because they're Japanese or Catholic or gay or transgender or Hindu. Learn about them, celebrate diversity. That is the plurality of the ADL's budget. But we also, in the ADL office, if you come to our office to meet, you will walk through a steel reinforced door, past bulletproof glass, another steel reinforced door. There are different key cards sometimes, depending on the threat. Matt and Sally will tell you that the first hour of the first day that they worked for the Anti-Defamation League, we had a security briefing that I gave them on the threat analysis against the ADL and against the Jewish community, because there are people that don't think that it should be Brotherhood and Sisterhood Week every week, like we do, and we track them. We track right-wing extremists, terrorists from the Middle East, terrorists from Yonkers, left, right, center, extremists of all kinds, and that's dangerous work. But the fact of the matter is that you can try and convince people at a young age through No Place for Hate, through the anti-bias work. Sometimes it works and we have great faith in those programs, and sometimes it doesn't. And for those, we also are the agency in America, the non-governmental organization that trains more law enforcement than any other organization in America. We train them on hate crimes, on extremism, on terrorism, but we have this belief that you can get to people when they are young and teach them fundamentals about the Japanese American experience, the Hindu American experience, let them understand and not fear others. And No Place for Hate is a classic example of that. I hope in addition to you, when you go back meeting your police chief, that you will find the ADL office in your area. 27 ADL offices, reach out to them, try and do joint programming with them, find ways into the anti-bias work like No Place for Hate or A World of Difference that we do. Those are programs that are obviously do not just affect Jews or Hindus. I mean, it's a broad-based anti-bias initiative.
This is maybe just kind of a practical question. What does a community do if they're feeling harassed by the city officials or city law enforcement?
Contact us.
So there you go.
We do, I didn't really talk about our LUPA work, which is religious land use. There's a lot of discrimination, particularly against mosques, but in certain types of religious facilities being built, and a lot of exclusion by city officials. And we've got, I need Eric Tree here because Eric's our LUPA guy. But we've got, just go on our website and take a look at the number of press releases and prosecutions under our LUPA. There's a ton of them. We've aggressively done that. And if it's law enforcement, that's my special litigation group. We prosecute, I didn't mention it, we prosecute all police officers for misconduct that violate federal civil rights. So any high-profile police shooting, whether it's Ferguson, whether it's Garner in New York, any of these, we prosecute all those. So if there's police misconduct based upon these, we'll take care of it.
So, but we definitely think that there's a way to educate police. In the last administration, every administration gets to set their own budget and set their own priorities. Everybody understands that. One of the things that we really appreciated, it was an announcement about a year ago, the Justice Department under the previous administration announced that they were going to do implicit bias training for every single federal law enforcement official in America, 28,000 federal law enforcement officials. And we think in exactly the same way as it's helpful to train students and teachers on bias and anti-bias and respect and understanding, that it would be a real compliment, Tom, for the Justice Department to complement the work that they do on oversight with law enforcement with the training for law enforcement. Start with the federal government. The implicit bias training is really, really important to be able to pick up cultural signals from diverse communities, but also to be able to go to some of the issues that communities like St. Paul over the weekend are so concerned about, just in terms of trust of the police. That's part of the reporting problem too. Do you trust the police? And I think there's a direct correlation between a sense that the police have been trained on how to identify hate crimes, but also what are the cultural signals and implicit biases that are being trained. I think the federal government can really lead on that.
The point of just open communication and not having your first call to law enforcement being in times of trouble, but in, for celebration, if a temple's having a grand opening, or you have a speaker or something, it's a great opportunity to reach out to law enforcement. We went out to Allentown, Pennsylvania at the cow sanctuary when someone had left a severed cow head at the driveway of the sanctuary. And when we brought together leaders from the temples and from the local community, and then there was state police there. The first conversation was, well, we've never called the police, and the police said, well, we didn't know whether we were welcome. So oftentimes it's not even a matter of, there might be bias, absolutely, but sometimes it's just a matter of shaking hands and saying hello. So I think it's really important for our community to have that outreach. And it's an opportunity to educate as well and have a Hinduism 101. That also opened up the opportunity for us to provide a Hinduism 101 at the state level in Pennsylvania. But those things start at the grassroots level. If HAF went in to just call the state police, that may not have happened. But the fact that there were constituents who said this is important to us, we all kind of are pegs of a process that can help ensure the safety of all communities. I'm going to shift to a political question, and that is, and this is something that came up when we went out to Kansas, that there's sometimes resistance to hate crimes legislation. There's the notion that our current infrastructure already addresses hate crimes. So why have an enhancement? I don't know to what liberty, well, I know you two can talk about it, I don't know what liberty you are, to address that what's the impact of politics on all the work that we're involved in?
Yeah, I'll say it broadly. Certainly within the Department of Justice, there's no impact on politics. I mean, it really isn't. I mean, we are, and this comes straight from the AG, I mean, he's been very, very clear, particularly in the area of hate crimes, that we're going to enforce aggressively, and he's pushed resources that way. If you look, I think there were a lot of people that, when this administration came in, thought that my division would be cut in half. All our people would, if you look at the budget, our budget, we actually increased. It's been a focus. It's now priorities are going to change, but we are aggressively focusing on the hate crime area from a budget standpoint and a commitment. It's not a political issue. It's a recognition that we need to address all kinds of problems. So from that standpoint, we're doing it now with respect to the legislation. I mean, I think you're going to see that, in terms of our legislative priorities, you'll see that through.
So I guess I would, on the political question, I would talk about two things, I guess. I mean, one, the Hindu American Foundation was one of the groups that worked alongside the Anti-Defamation League for 13 years to get the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. And I don't know if the people, how many people in this room were not alive in 1998? Okay, thank you for revealing yourself. So sometimes I talk about the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, and people go like, who's Matthew Shepard? Who's James Byrd Jr.? And you can't just assume that you know who they were. So James Byrd Jr., a 49-year-old African American, he was asking for a ride home. Two guys gave him a ride home, but they did it on the back of their pickup truck. Logging chains tied him to the back of their pickup truck. He was dismembered on a country road in Jasper, Texas. Matthew Shepard was a 21-year-old University of Wyoming student. He was murdered by two guys who offered him a ride home from a bar. He never got home. He was put up against a barbed wire fence, left to die after being brutally beaten. My experience is if you name a federal law after you, it's probably not a good thing. The Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, and it took 13 years to get that law passed. Now maybe if someone else would have been the chair other than me, it could have been like 8, 9 years, something like that. But working together, it took us 13 years, and the reason was politics. The reason was we don't want to put sexual orientation into the law. We're not going to do that. Even for people that are dead, bloody, or beaten, there was a political opposition to passing this law, which, as the acting Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights can tell you, is about investigating the murder, the beating of people, no matter who they are, including gender identity, which passed after 13 years in the Matthew Shepard Act too. So political and politics plays a role. I think that's what's happening in Indiana, in South Carolina, in Wyoming, in Arkansas, in Georgia. We are insisting, the Japanese American Citizens League, HAF is insisting that every law that's passed be inclusive. And that's a problem in those 5 states so far that we hope to be able to overcome. And the other thing I would say is, it's true that the Justice Department has been outstanding on hate crime issues, and it's delightful to hear Tom Wheeler say how they're bulking up, and clearly the Kansas case demonstrates that they're leaning forward on these issues. Very, very welcome. But the idea that another section, civil rights, the Department of Education, is stepping away from guidance on transgender students is deeply troubling. And these are cases also that the Justice Department is involved in enforcing and prosecuting, but the idea that these incredibly vulnerable kids are no longer explicitly seen as being covered under Title IX, sure, the courts will work it out whether they are or not, but to have the Justice Department on your side is incredibly important. And the Justice Department is no longer on the side of Gavin Grimm, and that's unfortunate, this transgender kid in Virginia, and certainly we think politics and a different worldview has a role in that. So politics does play a role, and that's where you come in too. You need to insist that your local officials care about the things that you care about and are attentive to the things that you are really thinking about as well.
I just have one comment on the political side. There's a great American story that we talked about, and again, sharing that information. Michael, you probably are very well aware, may have been involved in terms of, it took 44 years, but the American Civil Liberties Act. In 1988, which was the formal apology to the Japanese Americans for what the U.S. government did in terms of the concentration camps and the forced evacuation. So in the end, but it took many years, but that was through many organizations coming together and saying this was wrong. So again, in the end, politically, times change. And it may not be short term, but in the end, and it is, again, learning from our past and educating in terms of what we can learn from those experiences.
So I've got it, since Michael called me out there. What you need to understand about transgender guidance, number one, it doesn't leave the student without protection. The transgender guidance made it very, very clear that individuals, transgender individuals, are protected under the sex-oriented stereotyping. The issue with the guidance itself is said it took a step that Congress should take, which is if Title IX is going to cover gender identity, Congress should do that. The problem with the transgender guidance that was issued in the prior administration is someone like me, an unelected bureaucrat, simply said gender identity is now covered within the statute. So if somebody can say that, somebody can unsay it as well. That's why we have a rulemaking process. We have a process that goes through with full, it didn't go through any notice and consent rulemaking. It was just declared. So somebody could undeclare it. You know, somebody sitting in my spot could take those rights away because they weren't given either through notice and comment rulemaking or through congressional action. That's the concern that we had with that particular guidance, that it should go through the proper rulemaking process. That's as simple. They were clearly protected. They will remain protected. I've litigated those cases on behalf of those individuals. Sex-oriented stereotyping is fully protected, continues to be protected, and that was made clear in the letter, the revised guidance letter that went out. So that's my nickel on that side.
So another 2 cents.
I'm going to use up all the time now.
No, this is the last. This is the last.
All right, so
I would just say
okay.
how important it is to have the United States Department of Justice file on your side. So we filed in the Gavin Grimm case, and so did the Department of Justice. And to have the Justice Department file on your side, incredibly important. So yes, we agree that Title IX, it didn't affect the actual substance of the protections, but to have Justice Department be on your side is incredibly important. And now they're not.
The last word on the Gavin Grimm case, the question the Gavin Grimm case specifically asks now isn't whether, the problem is that there's something called hour deference, which means if I tell you what a regulation says and I'm the administering agency, the courts have to give deference. That means it's just like, so what happened is this case was going to the Supreme Court based upon what my predecessor had just simply said the law should be, and the Fourth Circuit adopted that. Okay, gender identity is included in Title IX. Didn't go through Congress, didn't go through rulemaking. Now that case is exactly where it ought to be, which is gender identity protected under Title IX based upon congressional action? Is it read in there? And I think that's phrased appropriately. Not whether my predecessor simply said it was in a guidance. So that was the last word.
That was almost like mock
I never
trial
get the
there.
last word.
It can be the last word.
Thank you.
One last question, and then I will ask all of you, and we'll maybe start reverse order with some closing remarks. But this kind of talks about the overlap of freedom of speech and hate crimes. That is it possible that hate crimes aren't reported or not recognized because of our understanding of what freedom of speech is? What is the difference between freedom of speech and a hate slur? And at what point should you be reporting these things? Anyone?
I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
The lawyers in the room will know that the best kind of Supreme Court decision is unanimous, written by the Chief Justice, not very many footnotes, and that is Wisconsin against Mitchell, the 1993 case that you can look up, and you will find that hate crime laws do not violate First Amendment speech. The penalty enhancement that the court recognized that that these are different kinds of crimes. That you're not being punished for your speech, you're being punished for your conduct. And you can hate Hindus, hate Jews, hate Catholics, hate Japanese, hate people that went to Purdue University, although that would probably be different. But if you act on that hate, that's where the conduct comes in. And Wisconsin against Mitchell makes it very clear that hate speech is protected. When we go back to our office this afternoon, we're going to finish up testimony that we're giving tomorrow to the Senate Judiciary Committee on free speech on campus. Wide variety of free speech on campus. But our testimony says we totally support free speech on campus, but have no delusion that there's not a harm that comes from that speech, and be prepared to take action to have your campus community be prepared for that, girded for that.
I'll do 2 seconds on because I spent a lot of time on it. I'll jump to the back end, which is campus free speech. One of the major problems, and you guys will address it, and it'll be heard tomorrow in the Senate, on campuses is this kind of the First Amendment idea was called the heckler's veto, which is I don't like what you're saying and it offends me and therefore you can't say it. That's a real struggle in the campus free speech area. We've seen a lot of targeting of minority communities, Jewish communities in particular, Jewish students on campus. We've seen a lot of Arab students on campus being targeted, speaking out on various sides of the issues in campus free speech. It's a struggle. And on the colleges and universities, that's more of a struggle. The K-12 area, it's a lot more restrictive because of the nature of the kids and the nature of the classroom. The struggle, the thing that really has concerned me, and again, that's why I spent a lot of time working is in the cyberbullying area. You know, when you're making these comments, we have what's called the direct threat analysis, which is it directed at particular individuals or a private individual. But you know, how do we, within the context of the free speech, and the courts are not allowing schools to go out and really punish for this just vitriolic speech that kids are posting online, frequently directing at other kids. That's a real struggle, and I think we're going to end up fighting it out in the courts, and we've got to get the right case to the Supreme Court to figure out how we reach. I mean, there's a lot of issues that goes into it. We've got to, from a school standpoint, you've got to figure out how to reach and touch that speech somehow, even though it was generated off campus, because every kid has a cell phone, every kid is on 24/7, so it always comes on campus, and those kids, it's just devastating to those kids. And so far, the courts have been very reluctant to allow schools to go out and touch that. But it's an issue near and dear to my heart. It's something that we're going to engage on with that.
Yeah, we're definitely going to read your paper now.
There you go. But I think you'll see DOJ engaging in some of those areas.
Well, with that, if you want, we'll start on this side. Ron, if you want to just give some closing remarks or thoughts.
So thoughts rather than a comment, and the thought is it's so nice to see such a wide, diverse audience across ages. And also, just in terms of your involvement, as was mentioned before, means a lot, and especially when you're meeting locally with local elected officials, police departments, but also key coalition partners in the community. And I will leave my information, which you have, by all means share that, so that I would be more than happy to connect you with JACL chapters throughout the country, to, if you haven't been working with them, to at least open that dialogue. Again, so thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel.
Yeah, I will start by saying thank you as well. I'm, you know, if I'm offered the opportunity to participate in the third policy conference, I feel confident that I would agree. So really, I think it's incredibly important. In 1958, the then junior senator from Massachusetts, guy who later became very, very famous, John F. Kennedy, wrote a monograph, which I recommend to you if you've not read it yet. It's called A Nation of Immigrants. And the Hindu American community is an immigrant community. The Jewish American community is an immigrant community. The Japanese American community is an immigrant community. And there has been discrimination and hatred and bias directed at us from those who are different from us. Fear, hatred, mistrust, misunderstanding. There's much we can do about that. The monograph talks about how, it's fabulous reading, even today. It really stands the test of time. And it talks about how even the people that came here who are not immigrants, Native Americans, the people that came here involuntarily, slaves, that we are all here now. And the idea that America is strengthened and America is stronger because of immigration and because of the creative talents that we bring from our native countries or wherever we came from is absolute. So you have a right to be here. You should know that you have a right to be here. The government officials that work with us and for us should hear your voice. and know clearly what you are asking for when you are lobbying. And I want to say that this is not just like a 2-day gig in Washington. This is something that must continue. It can't just be, you come to Washington, super interesting, you hear some interesting speakers, lovely leadership is demonstrated, but then you go back and you keep working. You are not daunted by the challenges that you have going back. There's a lot of things that are troubling and wrong, and we can do something about some of them. And that's what we should do, one by one. Pick your issue when you go back, whether it's hate crime, whether it's bullying, whether it's something having to do with foreign policy, having to do with India, multinational relationships. Pick your issue and try and make a difference.
I'll just be real quick. I'll jump on what Michael said there. I mean, one of the things that became glaringly apparent when I came into this position, coming inside the government, is he's exactly right. You've got to get out and you've got to engage. Because you know what? The people that are engaged are the ones that get their issues answered. And if you're not out there engaging every day, it's not the 2-day stop. These legislators, everybody brings in their group, they drop in, they arrange their meetings, they listen to a staffer, and then they're off. If you don't keep at them and keep going, do your groups, that's what you need to make a difference. Same thing within our agency. You know, we've got, relatively speaking, we have a small operation, but versus all the entire United States law enforcement thing. But if you bring these things to us, we'll look at them. I mean, we'll get them, and you'd be surprised at how few people actually do that. I make these invitations all the time. You know, if you have an issue, get with us and we'll take a look at it. Because if you send me an email or you send an email to one of my people, it will go to one of my staffers and I will say, what's going on here? Why aren't we doing this, that, or the other thing? So again, it's engagement. Get out there and engage. I mean, you've got to do that, and you've got to do it consistently. It starts with your school board. It starts with your city council. Goes on to your representatives, your state government, and the federal government. All politics is local. Start locally, engage locally. These are great, but you're going to make your difference, and Michael knows this as a grassroots activist. It's all about working with those local entities, because that's where the change really takes place.
Well, please join me in thanking taken away something from this and some motivation to go back to our respective communities.